Hello and welcome to today's Safety and Health webcast, Lockout-Tagout 2020, a look at the future of Lockout-Tagout solutions, sponsored by ESC Services. My name is Kyle Morrison. I'm the Senior Associate Editor with Safety and Health magazine, and I'll be moderating today's session. Thank you for joining us. We'll start the presentation in a few minutes, but first I'd like to go over some housekeeping items. The views of the speaker and his organization are his own and do not necessarily reflect those of the National Safety Council or Safety and Health magazine. Mention of any commercial enterprise, product, or publication does not mean the Council or the magazine endorse them. At the end of today's webcast, we'll have a question and answer session. To ask a question, simply type it in the text box located in the lower left-hand corner of your screen, then click the Submit Question button. Feel free to ask your question at any point during the presentation. You don't have to wait for the Q&A session to begin. We'll try to answer as many questions as we can, but due to the large number of participants today, not all of the questions may be answered. However, all unanswered questions will be forwarded on to today's speaker. For basic troubleshooting information, please click the Help button located on your screen. At the end of the webcast, you'll be asked to complete an evaluation survey, and I'll talk a little bit more about that after the presentation. This webcast will be archived for 3 months, so you can access it after today's live presentation. Within about a day, just simply return to this same URL to access the webcast. Okay, with that, I think we're ready to begin. Our speaker today is Jimmy Michalczuk. Jimmy is the CEO and co-founder of ESC Services, which seeks to eliminate workplace accidents related to servicing machinery through education and custom-developed, fully graphical energy control procedures. Jimmy?
Kyle? All right, we're going to go ahead and get started today. Again, my name is Jimmy Michalczuk, CEO of ESC. ESC has been a company that's dedicated to lockout for over 10 years now, and it's by work volume the world's largest lockout-tagout service company. One of the things that we try to strive for as a company is education, and that's why we're motivated to do this webinar today, is that we feel there's a big education gap in what companies know about lockout-tagout and how far you can take the capabilities to get the most amount of efficiency. So just to reiterate, this is not a sales presentation, and it won't be salesy throughout, I promise. It's really just about education, and it's all about you as the attendee getting what you came here for. As Kyle had mentioned, we likely won't be able to get through all the Q&As today. However, our website, escservices.com, and myself are available as another source of learning information as well as connecting up to answer your questions specifically. We'll be happy to help and help us complete the mission of getting the education out. All right, we're going to go ahead and get started then. Starting it off with a poll. On a scale of 1 to 10, how much is Lockout-Tagout viewed as a hindrance to production in your company? So there's 4 choices, kind of put them in buckets. 1 to 3 being no noticeable hindrance to the production, with B as 4 to 6, moderate hindrance to production, C 7 to 9 with being a huge hindrance to production, and 10 being nearly impossible due to the hindrance to production. And there's ways we've probably heard all of these stories and all of these viewpoints. So no one viewpoint is right, and this is an anonymous survey, so you'll just see the poll results when we go to the next slide. So go ahead and make your selections now, and we will take a look at those results. And this is what the people who are on the line, over 1,000 attendees who are on this webinar, rate their viewpoint of Lockout-Tagout right now. So luckily not many think it's impossible, but you can see how the moderate hindrance to production curve is right in the middle, and some saying no noticeable hindrance. It's just a fact of life, or the production isn't varied. Perhaps different stories for everything. Again, no right answer. It's just a great way to see how Lockout-Tagout is viewed. So that's a great graphic for the attendees to see. And that's the graph that we're seeing here. All right, we'll give you a couple more seconds to check that out, and then we'll go on to the next slide here. This is the outlook for today. We will try to stay on track, but this is generally what we're going to do is review the current state of Lockout-Tagout. what the basics are, just a real quick recap in 5 minutes so that we're all on the same page. Then we're going to do a deep dive on today's best solutions and benefits from those solutions. Then we're going to explore the future of Lockout-Tagout from our perspective of the experience we have and partner companies we've worked with and are partnered with, so we've known in the pipeline products that are coming to market that we have permission to talk about that have not hit the market yet, so it's some things to keep in mind. And then we're going to go through a quick break while you fill out the final survey, compile a list of the questions you want, and then I think the most valuable part for the attendees here is going to be the Q&A session to get the answers you need so that you can make good, educated decisions for your lockout program. So again, starting it off with the basics and review. I'm sure many of you have seen this, especially if you're safety specialists, but it looks startling to some, especially if somebody hasn't been in the field. This is a list of fatalities that happen every year for the last 20 years, and you can see, surprisingly, the fatality range remains fairly flat, and it is dropping. In fact, if you graph this line out, it's about a 1.5% drop over 20 years. Now, many are applauding this effort, and many are skeptical about why the numbers are dropping. What I would say is that there are reasons for both sides. And let's get into that now. With employment in the United States, since that time period, so we're comparing the same exact time periods, the employment has actually risen about 1% for the last 20 years. So you're talking about 34 million new workers added to the workforce over the last 20 years, yet fatalities have still decreased at 1.5%. And so that's the side that says we should be applauding OSHA because we are reducing the fatalities despite an ever-growing number of workers. However, when some people look at it, they say there doesn't seem to be a correlation between the total number of the workers that are out there and the accident, because the workers are going up, yet accidents are going down, so it must be OSHA. However, when you look at the numbers a little closer, you'll see that, we'll go here. I think I skipped a slide. The fatalities have decreased about 1.5%. The number of employees have declined about 1%, and that is in manufacturing. So the correlation is actually stronger in manufacturing. So we'll skip over to that right now and just take a look at that graph, and then we'll come back to this. The graph for the manufacturing sector is a little more interesting and telling. So over the last 20 years, this line with a slope of about 1% decline actually correlates very well with our reduction of accidents in the workplace. So despite all employment going up, with manufacturing environment going down in correlation, there could be strong causality there, meaning that the reason these accidents are going down is because there could be less people in the harsh environments that these accidents were occurring, hence manufacturing jobs. So let's take a look at the manufacturing profile and ask ourselves, how does Lockout-Tagout impact safety with manufacturing? Now, I know there's a lot of companies on the line, and just because we're talking about manufacturing right now doesn't mean it doesn't apply to you, but we're just really doing a deep dive on the stats. And these are statistics people don't usually get this far into. But we do because we're trying to figure out why these accidents are still occurring at high rates and yet getting less attention these days. So let's look at manufacturing in closer detail, and then we'll jump back out of this. Recently, U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics rated manufacturing as one of the top most dangerous jobs on the top 10 list. It's number 9. And again, of all these industries that are above this, this is the one most affected by Lockout-Tagout. And then, so that was the industries. Oh, I'm sorry here. Push that against. This is the top 10, all industries here on the top 10. And here is the fatality rates for all, manufacturing ranking as the number 9 right now. On the next slide, you'll see that manufacturing, the industrial machinery maintenance worker, is actually rated number 8 most dangerous occupation. Now that's significant because if you look at every one of these occupations above that, there's not many that would be protected from Lockout-Tagout. Now, this is really the first one that is 100% preventable fatalities if you're servicing the machine and you're killed in this case and part of that statistic. So being on the top 10 list means we can focus on that and we can make a difference. With those numbers said, the reflection of the significance is right here. There's an 18.5 per 100,000 death rate in the manufacturing environment, which is actually 5.6 times the national average. So when we say Lockout-Tagout, yes, it applies to every company out there. It applies to administrative buildings, hospitals, hotels, casinos, banks. And then what we look at is where are the people most likely to be injured? And it's going to be manufacturing when it comes to Lockout-Tagout. So with 5.6 times the national average, and Lockout-Tagout has the biggest impact on saving their lives, let's look at Lockout-Tagout a little different and look at possibly being more conservative with the applause when we look at reduction of workplace fatalities. There could be some other reasons other than just a safer work environment. It's still very much dangerous. So what is Lockout-Tagout? Some people are still wondering, especially if they've been visited by OSHA recently, how Lockout-Tagout can be around for over a decade, over 2 decades, and still be something that's on the top 10 list every single year for most cited OSHA regulations. There isn't much to it, really. There's 5 basic components, but yet maintaining those components are very difficult, and there's subpoints to those components that actually get fairly tricky. So Lockout-Tagout, as a premise, is simply just controlling that hazardous energy to protect workers during service of the equipment. That's really all it is to it. Now, you want to prevent unexpected startup. You want to use locks and tags to prevent that. And you want to really just focus on protecting people with Lockout-Tagout. Lockout-Tagout has tangential benefits such as equipment protection and reduced downtime if it's done correctly. However, the main purpose of Lockout-Tagout is really just to protect people. It's done by applying that lock and tag to prevent that inadvertent startup. And it's accomplished by implementation of 5 key elements. And I'll start with the elements in order of really how they should be implemented, knowing that they all can't be implemented in a flash. The first is machine-specific procedures. And then next is employee training for authorized and affected employees. The third component is your annual auditing of both employees and the procedures. And the next component after the annual auditing is the corporate policy. The last component after the policy is implemented is the locks, tags, and devices. So with that, after all 5 components have been implemented, you will have a compliance system. How long that system stays in compliant is how well it's maintained, because every year the employees have to be audited, and every year all of the machine-specific procedures have to be audited for accuracy, as well as keeping up with new equipment coming in and old equipment changing in either location or the way it works. All of that has to be incorporated into the maintenance of the program. The next slide here. We're actually talking now about the best solutions available for each one of these components. So in the end of this presentation, if you do have questions on which components require certain elements, feel free to ask those. But right now we're going to make the assumption that everybody knows what those components entail, and we're going to talk about what are the best solutions available for each one. So the first component being the machine-specific procedures. What's the best of the best out there? What are the best companies doing? What is saving companies time and money and giving them efficiency? It's graphical Lockout-Tagout procedures. That is the lowest hanging fruit of the Lockout-Tagout program. Graphical Lockout-Tagout procedures are not required. When Lockout-Tagout regulation was written in 1982, they did not have digital cameras, PCs, high-resolution printers, so they wrote the regulation to be text-based and with the tools that were available at the time. Taking advantage of the extra steps to take it to a graphical approach and using these pictures as a map to point at the isolation points that need to be locked out and building the procedure to be very intuitive and easy to follow encourages usage. The top 3 benefits reported: up to 50% faster to follow. So when they're using this lockout-tagout procedure in the field, every time they use it, it can be up to 50% faster. So that's the return on investment right there over an older program. It's also easier to train the authorized employees. Authorized employees being defined as the ones who are in charge of locking out the equipment. So now they can be trained easier because the equipment is more straightforward. It's also safer to have a graphical lockout system because of its intuitive nature. It actually encourages usage. Somebody's less intimidated to use it, and they also know it takes less time to use this versus sorting through the all text-based procedure to get that critical information. We'll move on to the next component, which is the employee training. You can see across the top where we're going here. Employee training, what's the best of the best out there? Right now, it's having an advanced training that's interactive and automated, having something online, but yet complemented with the real-time feedback from instructors or safety managers that are able to answer questions. Lockout-Tagout training is only required to be given one time for the life of the employee forever in a business. Having a training be accessible and encouraging usage of the training module to be given to the employee on an annual basis is a good idea to help remind and upgrade the program's usage in the facility every year. So we encourage and recommend annual retrainings. The top 3 benefits are that the training is quicker and less costly. Interactive nature of the training actually ensures comprehension. And the high quality hands-on training aspect of the approach is giving employees targeted input. So with the old training, the bare minimum of what OSHA requires would be throwing everybody in a room, giving some information on lockout-tagout that you feel is adequate for their job, and making sure they prove that they can comprehend it. You could give them a small quiz, 4 questions, and a lot of companies have done this and gotten away with it. Compliance, yes. Efficient, no. The new systems are all about efficiency, getting to the same place much, much quicker, and in a lot of ways, and a higher level of safety involved as well. So the next module is the annual training, or annual auditing. So with the annual auditing requirements, real quick, OSHA requires that every procedure be audited every year. Additionally, authorized employees have to be audited as a minimum to ensure comprehension. What that means is when you implement all of these machine-specific procedures in your facility, you have to go out and physically check the procedure to make sure it's accurate every year. In addition to check to ensure it's mounted or check to ensure it's available for the authorized employees when they use it. The accuracy can change based on the equipment's location, energy sources coming into the equipment, and various other control methods or guarding. With the graphical procedure, it's easier to verify if something's changed because of the pictures. Taking it a step further, you can actually implement an annual auditing regimen using iPads with specialized applications to do your auditing, scanning the QR codes. And by doing electronic auditing, you're actually realizing the benefits of capturing that data and doing something about it. So with safety managers sitting at their desk, they can now see, using cloud-based software, real-time status updates of where your program is, and so that they're not surprised at the 12-month mark when they have to reach in and pull one of their highest paid and most sought-after employees to do an emergency audit so they don't fall out of compliancy. This way an audit can get done throughout the year, it's predictable, and they're more efficient that way. The top 3 benefits reported from these solutions that are out there: the audits are up to 85% more efficient, there's a higher quality data obtained and that you can do something about, and the data is accessible real time so that you can get a checkup of your program and not have to wait until the end of the year to realize you're out of compliancy. The next component we're going to look at is corporate policy. What's been done in the past is print it off, put it in a binder. Now some companies have taken advantage of their intranet and they put it on the intranet. That helps authorized employees access it if they know where it's at. We've heard time and time again, and that's why we put it in, we recommend putting it in electronically accessible format, is that the clients are saying, even though we have a policy, we've been cited because we couldn't find the policy when we were being inspected. Now, it's easy to get that dropped later, but the point is the policy is not just there for compliance. It's there for usage. And if they can't find it during an audit, it's likely they can't find it to use it when they need it. So by putting it electronically on that iPad, you're now using the iPad or tablet, whichever format you've used. You've used that now for your auditing electronically to get that real-time data, and now you're using it for your corporate policy to real-time update any sort of corporate policy changes and allow accessibility to any authorized employee who needs to gain access to that. The top 3 benefits reported from these solutions: easier to access now, and that would be from the user's aspect. And from the manager's aspect, if it's a safety manager or corporate director, you now can have instant updates, and that takes care of the controlled document problem, which is notoriously an issue if somebody's saving a local copy or if there's printed copies and you're trying to make sure the old copies were disposed of properly. With everybody using this as their sole source of versioning, it just eliminates all those issues. The third most cited benefit is that it reduces that chance for OSHA compliance and gives peace of mind that everything's going to be available when it's needed. The last component we're going to look at is locks, tags, and devices. This is the most obvious component when you're thinking of Lockout-Tagout. With Lockout-Tagout, many companies start and stop with locks, unfortunately. It's the easiest, and we put it in the last for a reason. It's the last component you'll need. So in the old days when Lockout first came out, they used security locks. Those are laminated padlocks, locks with keys that are designed to keep somebody out of a fence or gate, and they're designed to take a bullet. They're designed to be hit with a sledgehammer, and it's way over-engineered. They're too heavy. They're made for security, not just simply what the idea is, deterrent with Lockout. And so taking advantage of the philosophy of Lockout, now you can get locks that are lighter weight, less expensive, and have non-conductive shackles so that you've boosted the efficiency and safety of the program. Also, companies are putting stations at the points of use to eliminate walking to a remote location, to a central device location to get your locks and devices needed. So by having the stations, having various sized kits for your personnel, you can ensure that your program is optimized and efficient with simply buying additional product. Top 3 benefits: that the product is actually less expensive, and we've been told that it sticks around a little longer. The reason is because these locks are made for Lockout-Tagout, and they say Lockout on them. The older locks that are used for security are also very useful outside of the business. So many more people can take these locks and use them somewhere else. With Lockout-Tagout locks, they're really made for Lockout-Tagout. They're not made to secure a bike on a fence, and so the reality of somebody wanting a Lockout-Tagout lock outside the business is low, so it's easier to maintain that system. The last benefit is the quicker access to the boards and kits. The company likes that for the efficiency, and the people like it as well because it's just easier and encourages usage. So we're going to jump over now, take a quick break, and we're going to have another poll question. And it's just quickly asking, just a first gut reaction. From what we just went over, if your company utilized all of the best options that we just reviewed, would the perception of Lockout-Tagout improve in your company? And if yes, say yes. If no, say no. We didn't leave the maybes or I don't know because we really want to leave this as a black and white. For some companies, they could have the best of the best solutions, yet the culture might be so formidable that it might not make a difference from their perspective. So again, there's no right or wrong answer. It'll just be curious to see, with the best solutions that are available in the market, could that improve the perception of Lockout-Tagout in your company? And I'll click next here and we'll see the results from that. So interestingly enough, this is the results of, again, over 1,000 attendees here. If they utilize the best options reviewed that we just went over, would the perception of Lockout-Tagout improve in their company? The majority of the people are saying yes, it would improve. And so with that, it's simply a matter of convincing the company to invest the same way they invest in new machines, the same way they invest in new processes, SAP programs, software that makes the business more efficient. The perception of Lockout-Tagout improving your company has more to do than just safety. It's about return on investment and helping sell that program's usage beyond just compliance. Interesting results. So now we're going to explore the exciting part of why I think everybody came here. We went over the basics. We went over what the best of the best is out there right now, but that's not really the future of Lockout. That's what's there now. Let's explore now, which is more exciting, of options that are going to be available in the short and near long-term future. So where is Lockout-Tagout headed? And really, why are we reviewing this? It's so that you can prepare if you're in that position to do that. First, we're going to look at the actual hardware, which is, again, where I said most companies start and stop with their programs, or if they've attempted something and hadn't gotten very far with the locks. The locks can be a burden. Common issues we hear about locks are losing the locks themselves or the keys, trouble finding the correct key to lock out the right lock. So if they have 5 locks on a piece of equipment, they're going to have 5 keys in their pocket potentially, and they have to line each one up, so those takes time. And it's time consuming to coordinate, and there's also trouble controlling master keys. If a company decides to key something alike and they lose that master key, technically they have to throw out their entire lock system. So the future, what will come out is the reality is that it's going to be RFID or fingerprint, but physical keys won't be needed. The future locks will simply respond to an RFID on the employee's badge that they can wear, again, or they can use their fingerprint, but that's a secure way of knowing that they are the ones opening that lock. And knowing that the technology is improved, they can have replaceable batteries that will last for 2+ years that can get the job done for unlocking that lock. They'd be reprogrammable. You wouldn't have to be losing keys, and you'd have one key for all locks. So talk about speeding it up. This will bridge the gap between having the actual physical disconnects be lockable to having a lock that's made for the most efficient process. Additionally, with the RFID and electronic, we can have storage on these locks to actually track usage logs of when the lock was last locked and unlocked and who did it, because you'll have the ID of the RFID or the fingerprint associated with it to know who did it. So you could have shared locks in a cabinet. You could check them out, assign your RFID, and then go unlock and lock that. So that's where it's going to get exciting, that something so simple as just changing the lock could make Lockout-Tagout even more efficient than it is right now, even with the best solutions. We're seeing an estimated arrival time of these locks around 2017, and that's something that I think will be beneficial to many companies when they come out. So as far as the procedures go, that's the heart of every Lockout-Tagout program. How do you improve that? Right now we're hearing for the procedures themselves, the disadvantages in the market, even with the best solutions, it is still time-consuming to print procedures and mount them on the machine. And they say that procedures disappear from the equipment, whether or not it was on purpose or intended. That's a burden that has to be maintained. It's also time-consuming to ensure that you're matching the electronic copy with the procedure that's on there that's available for contractors or emergencies, so you always have that printed procedure. You're ensuring that those are always correlated. So those are the 3 disadvantages. In the future, all procedures will be electronic only. The procedure will be accessed by simply walking up to the equipment via RFID, and the updates will be made real-time and pushed down to all the tablets in real time, eliminating the need to print, mount, coordinate, any other burden that is of today of the documents. All of the tools are here for that today, and it's actually in process. And I can say the source on this is actually Scan ESC, which is the application we own, and this is where it's going. So it's giving you a future peek into where we're taking this in the next couple years is really to the next level, so that even though scanning a QR code is nice, RFID takes it to the next level, and having that ability to have everything electronic will give companies even more edge on the competition, and if it's purely looked at as a safety perspective, easier time maintaining their system that they do have. So overall, programs will be fully electronic, not just the Lockout-Tagout procedures. So there's no need to ever really print anything. In a lot of cases, companies will print a work order, then they'll print the Lockout-Tagout procedure. Efficient? Yes, it's more efficient than going out and trying to find the laminated procedure, but costly, yes, as well. Keeping it all electronic ensures that the updates are seamless, real-time, and that the data is very high quality. In the future, very near future, you're going to be able to be auditing the procedures and the people fully electronically with no paper trail whatsoever needed, with everything being backed up. Training and retraining can all be done on the iPad in the future. Right now, again, that's not possible. That's usually something that takes separate modules, websites, CDs, people. But in the future, the iPad will actually have the ability to offer interactive real-time training or retraining for those new employees or existing employees to help maintain the system and boost the efficiency. That element right there could be a game changer for many companies. And the third thing we're going to talk about is really testing for the comprehension. Important after they've been trained is that in the future they'll be able to be tested right there on the iPad. So not only are they trained and it's interactive, but they're tested to prove it through scenarios and virtual scenarios. Accessing the corporate documents, being fully electronic, never having to print those or rely on that. And lastly, documenting the usage statistics. All right. As far as what's going to be in the further future, let's talk about two things that are a little further out. This one's estimated arrival, we're saying about 2020, is that like many machines that are out there, if you've ever seen the saw stop machine, and I'm not endorsing that or selling it, it's that it actually uses a sensor. We looked into how that works to stop the saw immediately before it has a chance to hurt somebody as it makes skin contact. That same technology can be applied to any machine by inducing a small current and recognizing when human flesh has made contact. Now, this doesn't need to be applied to every machine, but should smartly be applied to more machines that have the ability or need the ability for people to interact with them in close proximity. So if there's constant or frequent jams on a machine and the people are constantly beyond the guarding fixing things, having the machine sense when somebody's in there, if the worst case scenario happened, would stop the accident from happening. So this is very likely low cost of entry as far as comparison to the accident that it's preventing, and easy to install in the equipment, existing equipment. And in the little more distant future, it could be 5, 10, maybe even a shorter period of years from now, we're going to see robots actually performing highly dangerous tasks like unjamming when there's potential tension in the machinery, or the completely unavoidable hazard of hydraulic potential. You could have a robot perform that task to verify that the hydraulic lines are depressurized. Right now, there's no safe way to do that, and that's probably the biggest vulnerability of a lockout program, is if you have hydraulic equipment and you're verifying de-energized, all you can do is check gauges, which may or may not be working, move valves, but if it's already de-energized from the electrical, it's very difficult to ensure hydraulic is fully locked out or depressurized. So by having a robot or a human-like machine do that, that will allow that task to injure the robot, not the person, and thus preventing these accidents from happening in the first place. Now, the robots could then interact with the machines and get more integrated in the future, where people will still always be part of the equation. They will just be reduced to the frequency at which they're put in harm's way, or that they need lockout-tagout to prevent that injury. So in the future, some energy control, or same energy control philosophy as we have today, just more complex equipment and less frequent human interaction needed. Most production equipment will have the sensors we talked about in critical areas to detect the human if it's in there, if the worst is happening, to prevent the injury from getting worse and definitely prevent the death there. For the most dangerous tasks, the robots would be used for that. But again, important thing to know now is to not despair that, well, the robots aren't here, so I guess we got to be unsafe until then. No matter really how far you go into the future, the philosophy of the lockout is the same now as it will be 100 years from now. It's to prevent that injury to people during certain types of service, and that will always really be required. So lockout's here to prevent the injury today. In the future, the robots are going to come in to help make the process more efficient as well. So the injury will always be prevented. How to prepare. The most important aspect in preparation for the future, as it's coming slowly in some cases, it's pretty far out, is measurement. Measure those key performance indicators of your program. So often production gets measured real time by the microsecond, but safety measurement is an afterthought. But if you can measure how long lockouts take and how long unlocks take, how long equipment was down due to lockout, and you can make improvements to your safety program to reduce that, that's the same level of investment, the same level of logic that a plant manager, vice president, or CFO would sign off on, because you have the return on investment now, a proof of return, or a track history of success. So by measurement, that'll be fantastic for growth of the program. Tracking the changes of the program with every investment, again, will just help justify that and encourage program growth. But the overall philosophy, and these three things really are wrapped together, is to just treat the safety program like other aspects of the business. If you have R&D, marketing, brand protection, anything else that's getting millions of dollars funding, but then safety program has a very tight budget, that's something to look, maybe looking at the safety program differently over time and looking at it not as a hindrance, but as a potential competitive advantage in that market. And another way to say that is if your competition's not doing this the most efficient way and you start doing it, you can have a higher margin of profit because you're reducing the burden on your business significantly. All right, so what we're going to do now, and I hope some of you have been writing your questions down, but if you haven't, feel free to start jotting those down. Fill in the survey form, and then we're going to go into the Q&A session, which we have allotted some time for.
All right, thank you. Let me push out that survey right now. And it should be popping up on the screen. And this is an evaluation survey that we're asking everyone to complete. The survey should be on your screen now. If it's not showing up, please make sure your pop-up blockers are turned off. We value your input because filling out the survey and telling us what you think about the presentation, the great presentation Jimmy just had, helps us improve future webcasts. So please do take the time to fill that out. All right, Jimmy, again, thank you for that great presentation. We have a lot of questions, so I don't want to waste too much time talking myself. I want to just dive into the questions. One of the first questions we have is, let me see if we bring it up. There were some questions about RFID. You spoke a lot about that, and I think there's some confusion out there. What exactly is that, and what does it stand for, RFID?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I take it for granted sometimes when I hear these lingo terms thrown around. RFID, as an acronym, stands for Radio Frequency Identification. Now, while it sounds specific, it's a very broad usage. So they use it for security cards now in buildings. If you get hotel rooms, you might have an RFID card instead of a magnetic strip, but it works the same way as a unique, very encrypted, very long encryption identification ID to secure things. So you can use that in the future, RFID will be used for all sorts of things. You can scan a room if you have an RFID scanner, and you can find all the elements in the room. So depending on how it's used, you can find that you can put a smartphone up to a RFID chip, and when it's within a half an inch, it gets the data. Or you can, again, walk into a room, and if you have the right scanning equipment, you would be able to read whatever's in that room. So it's as if you just walked in the room and you had a laundry list of everything that's there. So taking those two capabilities, you can kind of read between the lines and see how that might be able to be very useful in Lockout-Tagout. As I was saying, if you just walked up to the machine and you didn't have to select or scan a barcode or find that from a list, it simply just popped right up on your iPad or tablet or smartphone that you're holding, so you know exactly what procedures for that equipment when you have that app open.
Okay, great. I want to talk a little bit about some of this aspect about Lockout-Tagout procedures and whether it's in written copy or it's on a database. You brought that up. What are the requirements? If you have it just on an online database, does that mean you can get rid of the hard copies, or are hard copies of your Lockout-Tagout procedures necessary for compliance?
Well, I'll say this. There's no rule against it. But I sure wouldn't want to be you when OSHA's there and says, prove to me that these procedures are available and you have a power outage because it was on your intranet, or you had everything on the iPad accessible, but the iPad's battery was dead. You will receive a citation, and it won't be avoidable. It won't be that, oh, we got the power back up, we can show you. So there never can be a gap in the availability of those Lockout-Tagout procedures. So as a minimum, and again, OSHA didn't have the foresight and imagination to think of what the tools we would have today. They never said you couldn't put it on the intranet and have that as your only copy, or have that electronically available on the website on a special section under sign-in. But the disadvantage would be that if it cannot be absolutely guaranteed up 24/7 and there's even the smallest amount of chance for gap, then you're technically out of compliance right there. So what we do to bridge that is we have a printed off binder copy at the very minimum as the absolute safety net. If all technology goes to heck, you actually have that printed off binder that everybody can come to.
Okay, great. We had a question here regarding third-party maintenance and services. In such a situation, who is responsible for the written procedure, lockout-tagout? Is it the owner of the equipment or the service provider?
Third party is a great question. That's probably one of the toughest scenarios to solve with Lockout. I do have an absolute answer for it. I know exactly what OSHA will say because we've dealt with it. With third party, if there's a company, and I'll clarify this for others who might be wondering exactly what we're talking about, is that if I'm reading this correctly, the third party maintenance provider is going to be a service company coming in to maintain equipment for somebody else. So if I'm the company and I'm hiring a company to come in and maintain my equipment, who's responsible for that lockout procedure? The answer, unfortunately, is both. Now, OSHA wants a lockout procedure. It doesn't want two copies. It doesn't want one over the other. It just wants a procedure to be available for the employee. Now, what I'll say that gets complicated is when there's an accident, and this has happened, and somebody's hurt or killed, they will investigate, and they'll say, where's the procedure? And the company, like me, who hired the company to come in, I'll say, they should have provided it, and they didn't. And so then we're both liable. OSHA will give a multi-employer citation there. So I could be cited right there up to $70,000 for not having that procedure because I knew I didn't have it. And that other company could be cited $70,000 for willful negligence as well for not having that procedure. Per procedure. So if I had 4 employees and they're all for her, it's per instance, by instance citation.
So what's the solution here? Is it just the two different companies getting together and formulating a plan together?
Yeah, there's 2 ways to go about it. And the unfortunate thing for that outside maintenance company, they're going to be servicing hundreds of pieces of different types of equipment in different clients all over the United States. So they have a way bigger burden to comply. It's very difficult for them to protect their employees legally. Now, there are solutions that you can do. I don't think we have enough time to talk about them today, but basically you're going to develop a template so that your procedures can be developed in a very quick way for different types of machines. So you might service 500 different types, but when you really break it down, you might service types that can be very easily created off of a template by that person. And as you're creating those, you're building a library, and that library will help serve the next person from having to recreate it. So as the outside contractor, that's your perspective, and as the on-site owner, it's my duty and responsibility to create all of the procedures for all of my equipment. So when I hire somebody to come in from the outside, they're protected and I can ensure they're not going to get hurt. Or if they do, it's not because of my procedure.
Okay, I want to ask a question kind of branching off of what you just said there. So does there have to be a lockout-tagout procedure for every piece of machine or equipment, or can there just simply be one generalized procedure?
That is the number 1 most frequently asked question on Lockout-Tagout, so I'm glad somebody asked that. And I'm going to skip over to this. If you can see your screens here. These are the 8 criteria that OSHA requires every piece of equipment to pass in order to not need a procedure. And I know that's a mouthful what I just said. I'll say it in a different way. If you have a piece of machinery that does not meet all 8 criteria here, it has to have a procedure. So you could go about creating your procedures 2 ways. You could do an inventory list of all your equipment, and then you could run every single piece of equipment through these 8 criteria to see if there's any that pass, and then create procedures for those other non-passing equipment that didn't pass these 8 criteria. And then I'll save you some time, and I'll tell you like 95% or up of all your equipment out there, don't just think of it as production, will require those procedures. So here's some examples that often are missed. MIG welders, they have electrical, gas, thermal, and in addition to, it could be capacitors or battery backups in them as residual energies. Grinder is often missed. This could be, believe it or not, it could be a $150 grinder, but it could be up to a $70,000 fine if somebody gets an amputation of a finger in this, and OSHA will come and look for that procedure because it has kinetic energy as a secondary source. So when you do have time, review those 8 criteria. It says there could be no potential for residual energy. kinetic energy is residual, it's also a secondary source to electrical. Oftentimes people say, oh, it's cord and plug, it doesn't need it. That's a fallacy. That is not a criteria for whether or not it needs a procedure. That's a criteria for whether or not you need to apply a lock to it. So do not believe the cord and plug fallacy out there. And this, often overlooked, exhaust fan. It could be small, it could be large. The premise is always the same, electrically powered and kinetic energy, same as the previous piece of equipment. Again, often overlooked, and it's just sitting out there as a citation potential. And this piece of equipment and all like it, portable equipment, is not exempt. It requires a procedure just like the machines that are fixed in your facility. In fork trucks, you have gravity, hydraulic, potential thermal, potential for it to move, in addition to the ignition source, whether it's electric motor, propane, natural gas. So those hopefully will help you avoid some of the common pitfalls that other companies have fallen into.
Okay, great. You just listed out a whole bunch of different types of equipment that needs a procedure. And we had a question here. Can you recommend any methods to comply with the requirement for an annual review of written lockout procedures? And this individual says it can be nearly impossible with thousands of written procedures.
Yeah, the methodology for complying is what we went over right here. I'm going to push this to the audience, back to the slide, where you can actually audit these procedures very easily electronically. Now, the burden is to audit the procedures every year. The fact is, if a procedure isn't audited every year, it could be an inaccurate procedure, and it's going to sit there as a potential accident the next time somebody goes to use it and doesn't check it first. So if your audits can be done up to 85% more efficiently, and it could be done whenever somebody has time because you can audit them electronically, that speeds the entire process up. So again, this was the evolution of where it's going, but this is on the market today as we went over it as a basic component. I'm going to go back to that one here quickly. This was what's here today, where you can do the audits by scanning the QR codes, and you can see all of your audit data in the cloud, and it reduces your audits up to 85%. So, and it also can be done at people's convenience. It doesn't have to be done at one fell swoop. So you could have half your audit done before you even target that as an objective by having your users just, when they have a few spare moments, going out and auditing equipment in that 12-month interval. That's how a lot of companies are doing it now to save money and encourage usage.
Could you expand a little bit more on what determines a satisfactory result due to an audit?
Yeah, so an audit has a potential for uncovering inaccurate procedures. And it's the overall safety net. Those procedures should never be inaccurate, because as the equipment changes, you should be making the changes to the equipment. So an audit theoretically should never be needed. But through experience, everyone who's been in writing the program for OSHA and everyone who's used it knows that the equipment gets changed by a contractor. That change doesn't get translated up to the safety manager, and the procedure is sitting on that piece of equipment is wrong until somebody notices it. That's what the audit's for. So when you're auditing a procedure, the primary objective is to make sure it's accurate. And you do that in any way you have to do it to feel comfortable that it is accurate. They don't say you have to shut it down and lock it off. A lot of companies have misinterpreted that, and that has added an enormous amount of inefficiency in the lockout program, which is unfortunate, because if you shut down production to do these lockouts, you're costing your company tens of thousands, if not millions of dollars that could really be put into more important things that would yield bigger benefits, like the electronic auditing program or more locks and tags in the stations located nearby to help speed up the efficiency of that program. So again, short answer is just make sure it's accurate in any way you have to do.
Great. We have a question here asking you to expand a little bit on the use of tags versus locks. And this individual says that they have a complex system and use a tagging program to identify isolation points, which are then tagged using high tensile strength ties and tags identifying equipment not to be used. Is something like this acceptable?
It is not, and I think the primary reason is that locks and devices allow equipment to be locked out now. There are instances and what you would call exceptions to the rule where if something just can't be locked, for instance, a fuse in a panel next to other fuses, and you need to remove the fuse and put a new fuse holder in there to prevent that from being replaced, you could use a tagout system there, but you need to use an alternative method to ensure the equivalent level of safety, like an attendee or barricade tape or a secondary source to prevent that inadvertent. The philosophy behind Lockout-Tagout is that that lock is a physical barrier. Somebody's not going to accidentally remove a lock. They can purposely remove it. In fact, for most of the Lockout-Tagout locks, you could take a screwdriver and pry it off. But that's okay because it still served its purpose. It's a deterrent. It's not for security. And when you talk about tagout, unfortunately, everybody has the key for a tagout. It's called wire snips. It doesn't matter if they're high tensile strength. It's that everybody can remove that, and it can be inadvertently removed. We see this time and time again in power generation industry where they're using tagout because of the high number of tagout isolation points. And so instead of lockout, they are applying these tags. Time and time again, even with a redundant system and qualification steps and training, people will inadvertently remove an adjacent tag on a system, or it will fall off. In this case, if you're using high tensile strength and good tags, that shouldn't happen. But when that happens, if somebody accidentally removes it, then somebody else could turn that on, or that person could turn that on, and you're not really protected. The real question is, rather than ask about minimum compliance, which it's not, ask yourself, would you want to work on a piece of equipment that's only tagged out, knowing that at any moment somebody could turn on that steam valve or restart the electricity if your tag was cut off? Personally, I want to know I'm at least protected with that lock and tag that I've told somebody, it's me who's working on the equipment, do not start it up, and here's my lock on here that you do not have a key for. It will prevent you from making that mistake. That's the one thing that will protect people every time.
Now, this is kind of a question that kind of goes against what you just said, but is it legal to service a piece of equipment when it's not locked out?
In fact, it is. And we start off almost every one of our lockout trainings with that as an attention getter. Being a Lockout-Tagout company, and we're coming in there after already working with that company to develop their procedures so they already know us. That's the last thing they expect us to say is when we start a training, we say, we're here today to teach you how to avoid Lockout-Tagout. And everybody's eyes get big, and they're like, what are you talking about? This guy's just gone off his rocker. And then we explain that Lockout-Tagout is required by law. You're required to have these procedures. It's required by law to utilize in certain situations. And so then we teach every person how to avoid it safely and legally by ensuring an equivalent level of protection. Those tools aren't always available the day we say it, but as time goes on, they'll find that it's the investment in those tools that makes their program even more efficient, and everybody embraces it. Some good examples of those tools are better machine guarding to prevent the exposure to the hazard while somebody is doing this service. So a good example is maybe a case packer. If there's a jam, and the jam's in the middle of the machine every time, and the guarding's so far out you can't even, you're within 6 feet of it, you can't get to it. You have to open the guarding, shut the machine down, lock it out right now, and get in there and do it legally because you're within harm's way if that equipment starts back up. Now, one tool might be bringing that guarding in a custom way right close to the moving components so that you're protected, but that guard's designed in such a way that allows you to get to the jam with a tool and unjam that machine without technically breaking that barrier of the machine because they're protected by the guard. So you've established an equivalent level of safety because you haven't technically entered the machine. Another tool would be a standard operating procedure. So a good example of how to apply that. Let's say you have an air conditioning unit on your roof, and it has 6 lockout points. You need to go up and change filters. It's ridiculous to block off the cool water coming in and out, the hot water coming in and out. It does make sense to block off the fan because you don't need that level of current coming through, and especially if you're on the exposed side, which you shouldn't be for a filter change. But you would want to only develop your standard operating procedure for that task and say, this standard operating procedure for changing filter, you only need to lock off the electrical, that one electrical, and so what you've developed is not a lockout procedure because it's not zero energy state, but you have machine control and you have an equivalent level of safety for that task. That's all allowed. That's completely legal, and it's just as safe, but it's way more efficient to do that. Now, those standard operating procedures are not required by law, and there's no requirement for them to meet. So you're really jumping into the gray area with safety. But by doing that, by taking the time to write those, you're helping people do what they're probably going to do anyway, which is the way it makes sense to do it.
Okay.
And so that's the way to be safer, and surprisingly, it is legal to do that as long as you've taken the right precautions.
Okay, I wanted to we wanted a point of clarification real quick, and that is whether or not locks and tags have to go hand in hand, or can an individual just simply use lockout?
No, they don't, and that's another reason why that future lock we see coming out would be a great idea, is because you don't need the tag if somebody else can walk up and read whose lock it is by holding their RFID up there. So the important thing to know is who's locking that equipment out, and that it's your key in there, the only key will open it without unpredictability to it. So you can use just a lock with no tag, and I'd recommend having a space in that lock then for a picture, so it's really easy to see who's in there, and on the back you have space for rewritable information such as the date it was applied, and maybe what they're doing, so that if you have a long-bodied plastic lock, so something that's maybe 3-inch body on the lock to write on, and a long shackle that's needed, like maybe a 2-inch shackle, so you have a total of 5 inches on that lock, and you could use that lock as your lock and tag combined. The tag is just an informational step that will help identify and add efficiency to your program, another level of safety. But the short answer is no, the tag is not required with the lock. It's just highly encouraged.
Okay. Now, what are the best method companies are using to ensure that contractors know the magnitude of energy for each energy source?
The current methodology for contractors is to reference the on-site procedures. So just like that first question with the third-party maintenance coming in, if they're outside contractors are coming in, they may not be familiar with that equipment, especially as familiar as the on-site maintenance staff or people who put it in. So they need to be aware that what magnitude of the sources they're working on and how to protect themselves as they service it.
Okay. Great. We had a few more questions about audits I was hoping to go over real quick. What level should the audits be conducted? That is, who can be the person conducting the audit?
The good answer is anybody, except for the person doing the lockout. So that narrows it down, but also at the same time opens up the field quite a bit. So outside contractors, consultants can do your audits, and those are really good because it's third-party perspective, and the contractors and consultants are not friends with the people there typically, so they're not going to be tempted to scoot some things under the carpet. What we recommend is what's the most efficient typically for each company, and that's that you have the most available, least overhead person conduct your audits. That's qualified. So if you have somebody like an intern or somebody who's first year on-site maintenance person and they're still getting their feet wet, they don't have a whole lot of responsibility yet, that person's your best for the audit because they're going to look at it from a fresh perspective. They're going to reduce the burden of the program because they're the least usable in the company right now, and reduce the costs of that audit because they're possibly lesser paid than somebody who's been there for 30 years and is highly sought after. So
but there is a qualification there. They have to be qualified, and that's
they really need to be. They need to be trained on what lockout is. So running them through a training would help with that. But they do not have to be the authorized employees that are doing the lockouts in that company.
Okay, great.
So they really, and if you think about it, the people who are using the lockouts would almost take these audits for granted because they see the equipment every day. If you use somebody from the office or maybe a manager who's available to do the audits, they're going to look at it from a fresh perspective, and they're going to see these changes and discrepancies easier than somebody who sees it every day.
Okay. Fantastic. Well, unfortunately, we are running out of time, and I know that there were a bunch of questions we didn't get a chance to answer, but as I said earlier, all of the questions that we didn't get a chance to get to will be forwarded on to Jimmy, who can respond. Once again, I hope you take the time to fill out the evaluation survey that popped up on your screen earlier. And with that, that concludes Safety and Health Magazine's webcast. I'd like to thank Jimmy, ESC Services, and everyone who listened in. Thank you, and have a great day.
Thank you, everyone.